Deep Sea Embers Chapter 1 to 10. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 1. A thick fog that day. The boundless fog rolled thickly outside the window to the point where the outside world seemed to disappear from the other side, leaving only the chaotic, unclear light that somehow managed to penetrate into this house. It's through this dimness that light God maintained in this eerie silence. In the slightly messy single apartment, Zhou Ming was lying at his desk with a long pile of debris sprawled across the surface. His condition could only be described as haggard while he wrote in his diary book. Nothing's changed on the seventh day, and a thick fog had enveloped the outside. I do not know how, but an unknown force locked the window and deprived me of prying it open. The whole room seemed to have been cast into an isolated space by something. I can't contact the outside world either. The electricity got cut off since the beginning, along with the water tap that didn't flow. Strangely, the lights worked, and the computer kept running. I ripped the cord out of the wall to see. As if a slight breeze suddenly blew in from the window, Zhou Ming jerked up from his act of burying into the diary and looked up with those haggard eyes. Unfortunately, the noise was nothing more than his own illusion. There was no change, only the never-ending movement of the lingering fog outside the window and the eerie silence of his isolated dwelling in the apartment. Then his sight fell upon the windowsill where he had left the wrenches and hammers. There are still traces of his attempts in the last 7 days to pry open the glass. But now, these tools are nothing more than mocking evidence of failure. After a few seconds, Zhou Ming's expression became calm again. With this unusual calmness, he lowered his head again and returned to his writing. I am trapped with no clue how to escape. I even thought of tearing apart the roof and walls in the past few days. But after expending all my strength and ideas, I couldn't make so much as a dent in these walls. It's as if the walls were a box, and I'm the mouse trapped inside this box with no way out. The exception being that door. But the situation outside that door, it's even more wrong. Zhou Ming stopped again, slowly examining the handwriting he had left behind on the page before flipping back to the content he had written days ago. These were heavy and suppressed words, meaningless thoughts, irritable graffiti, and awkward jokes written when he forcibly relaxed his mind to avoid going insane. He didn't know the point of writing down these thoughts. In fact, he's never been a habitual diary keeper. As a middle school teacher, he's limited in leisure time, so he would rather spend his energy elsewhere when possible. Ads by PubFuture. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had a lot of leisure time after finding himself trapped inside the apartment room. It was like an absurd nightmare. Everything in the dream was operating against the laws of nature. Still, one thing's certain: after Zhou Ming exhausted all his means, these were no hallucinations nor dreams, but a world that's no longer normal, with him being the only normal thing here. After taking a deep breath, his eyes finally landed on the only door at the end of the room. Made of ordinary cheap softwood coated with a thin layer of white paint, the door handles were polished from years of use and slightly crooked from age. This was the only thing that could be opened, the only way out of here. If this enclosed alienated room was like a cage, then the most vicious thing about this cage was that it retained a door that could be pushed open at any time, luring the prisoner towards a particular predetermined path. But this, outside, wasn't somewhere Zhou Ming wanted to be. There are no old but intimate corridors, no sunny streets and vibrant crowds, and nothing familiar to oneself. Instead, there's only a strange and disturbing exotic land mixed in with an inescapable dilemma awaiting him, over there. But Zhou Ming knew that time was running out for himself, and the so-called choice never existed from the very beginning. Simply said, he's running out of food rations with the last of the bottled water mostly drained. If he doesn't head over to the other side of that door, then even the last glimmer of hope would be gone. Perhaps it's not so bad. The answer to this supernatural phenomenon might be over there as well if he looked hard enough. Zhou Ming took a light breath before lowering his head again to write the last few paragraphs in the diary. But regardless, the only option now is to go across the door. At least there is some food to eat on that weird ship, and my exploration and preparations in the last few days are enough to let me survive on that ship. Though limited, it's still better than nothing. Finally, to the latecomers, if I don't come back, and someone like a rescue worker in the future really opens this room and sees this diary, please don't take all that I have written here as an absurd story. It really happened. Although it sounds all too spooky and surreal, there really was a man named Zhou Ming that got trapped inside this crazy and isolated space in time. I did my best in this diary to describe the anomalies I saw, and I recorded all the efforts I made to get out of here. If there are any latecomers, please at least remember my name, at least remember all this that has happened. Ads by PubFuture. Zhou Ming closed the diary, threw away the pen into the holder, and slowly stood up from the messy desk. It's time to leave, before he falls into utter desperation and passivity. But after a short thought, instead of going straight to the only door that led to the outside world, he went straight to his bed. Confronting that strange world behind the door required the best of him, and the current mental state he was in no way good enough. Zhou Ming didn't know if he could fall asleep, but even if he forced himself to lie in bed and emptied his brain, it was better than going to the opposite side, in a state of mental exhaustion. 8 hours later, Zhou Ming opened his eyes again. Outside the window, there was still that chaotic fog, and the day and night skylight carried a spooky air of oppressiveness. Zhou Ming directly ignored the situation outside the window. Taking out the last of his remaining rations, he ate everything within 8 minutes and then came before a dressing mirror in the corner of the room. The man in the mirror still had messy hair, a haggard face, and no temperament to speak of. Nevertheless, Zhou Ming didn't look away because he wanted to imprint this image into his own head. After a long and eternal few minutes, he murmurs to the self-reflection, "Your name is Zhou Ming, at least on this side, your name is Zhou Ming. Always keep this in mind and never forget this." After that, he turned and left. Coming to the door that was all too familiar, Zhou Ming took in a deep breath and placed his hand on the door handle. He didn't carry anything extra on him, neither food nor self-defense gear aside from the experience he gained from the previous explorations, the reason being he couldn't bring anything even if he wanted to. The door wouldn't allow it. With a twist and audible click, he pushed open the door and revealed the black squirming mist behind the wooden barrier. It's a curtain of blackish gray, contracting and retracting like a living creature. Regardless of how he thought of the fog, battering waves could already be heard in his ears, followed closely by the salty scent of the ocean as he walked past the safety threshold of his room. No.B. Whatever brief momentary dizziness he had dissipated under the shaking from his feet. He's currently standing on an expansive wooden deck devoid of company and a towering sailing mast looming under those dark stormy clouds. It's the open ocean, but the water was dark and undulating with no end in sight. Looking down to examine his new body on this side, Zhou Ming found it to be buffer than what he last recalled. Though bony like a skeleton, it's a suitable match for the exquisite captain's uniform that he had on, as well as the black flintlock pistol of classical design hanging from his waist. But what he wore didn't matter, the main concern was himself. Was this really the him that he knew? Chapter 2 Inches The captain of the vanished. This is not the first time Zhou Ming had passed through this door to the opposite side. Since a few days ago, after he found himself trapped in his room by some freaky phenomenon, he's been coming through to seek help since it's the only exit presented before him. He still remembered the first time the door opened. It was the same wooden plank deck, the exact change to his body, and the courage he mustered to explore this side several times for help. But try as he might, no answer came, nor does he understand the strangeness of this ghost ship connected to the door. Nevertheless, he's at least gained some experience to get a preliminary understanding of this vessel. Like the previous times, Zhou Ming used the shortest time possible to rid himself of the dizzying grog of crossing over. Then he checked the condition of this body for the first time and the gun hanging from his waist. Everything's like he left it from the last visit. It seems my body will seamlessly switch every time I pass through the door. If only I could place a camera on this side to see what happens. That way I can confirm whether this body will change too when I go back. Shame, the objects of the two worlds aren't interchangeable. Oh well, at least I know I did walk into the fog and not just drop unconscious from my apartment according to the recording on that side. Zhou Ming muttered to straighten his theories. He knew talking to himself on the open deck would appear weird to an outsider, but who's to mock him anyways? There's not a soul in sight on this ghost ship, and this was his way of proving he's still alive. As the salty breeze blew across the deck and hit his blue and black uniform of unknown material, Zhou Ming sighed softly and turned around to face the door again. Placing his hand on the doorknob to turn it again, he pushed it inward to reveal the grayish-black fog from which he came. Beyond this was the familiar apartment that he's lived in for so long. But he didn't go through it this time. Instead, he closed the door and pulled it back to reveal the captain's quarter. Inside was a dimly lit cabin with exquisite tapestries hanging from the walls, a shelf with multiple ornaments, and a large mapping table at the center footed by a burgundy carpet. Ads by PubFuture. That's how the door worked. By pushing it open, it would lead you back to the apartment while pulling leads into the captain's room, the latter being the supposed norm. After entering the captain's quarter, he habitually looked to the left, where a person's high mirror was fixed to the wall next to him. There, reflected clearly, was the current appearance of Zhou Ming. It was a tall man with thick black hair, a short and majestic beard, deep eye sockets, and a look that demanded respect. Despite already over 40, his manly appearance blurred his actual age so one might mistake him for someone younger. Loosening the scruff around his neck, he went ahead and made a silly face in the mirror. Sadly, his temperament with this new self wasn't working. Rather than being friendly looking, he's more like a psychopathic serial killer. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. While Zhou Ming was performing these silly gestures, a slight clicking sound came from the direction of the mapping table. Without surprise, he saw the familiar goat-headed wooden statue on the table turning to face him little by little. The inanimate wooden block seemed to come alive at this moment, and the obsidian eyes embedded in the wooden face glimmered with light. The panicked memories of the first time he saw this strange scene flashed through his mind again, but Zhou Ming only cocked the corner of his mouth into a grin. He knows what's coming, and sure enough, a gloomy and hoarse voice came from the wooden mouth. Name? Duncan, Zhou Ming said calmly, Duncan Abnomar. The voice of the wooden goat's head instantly changed from hoarse and gloomy to warm and friendly. Good morning, Captain. It is good to see that you still remember your name. How are you feeling today, and how are you doing today? Did you sleep well last night? I hope you had a good dream. Today is a good day to set sail. The sea is calm, the wind is right, the temperature cool and comfortable, and there are no annoying naval fleets around. Captain, you know a noisy crew. You're noisy enough. Although it was not the first time he had dealt with this strange goat head, Zhou Ming still felt a shiver run through his spine at the moment. Finally, shooting a glare at the thing, he speaks through gritted teeth, quiet. Oh, of course, Captain. You like the quietness, and as your loyal first and second mate and lead sailor and normal sailor and scout, I know this very well. There are many benefits to being quiet, and there was once a medical field, or philosophy field or architecture field. Zhou Ming suddenly felt a migraine coming up on his temple as it throbbed from this incessant yapping. My meaning is, I'm ordering you to be quiet. Ads by PubFuture. The goat's head finally quieted down as soon as the word, order, came out. Breathing a sigh of relief, he stepped up to the mapping table and sat down on the chair. He's now the captain of this empty ghost ship. Duncan Abnomar was an unfamiliar name and an even more foul-mouthed surname. So why does he know this detail? No idea. That's something this body knew the first time he crossed over. Over here, Duncan was on a long journey with most of the details a missing blank. He did get the distinct feeling that he was on some grand sailing plan but knew next to nothing about the so-called plan or where it was headed. As for the actual ship owner, the real, Duncan Abnomar, seemed to have died a very long time ago. So what exactly was happening with him? Think of a person being imprinted with an impression. Instinct told Zhou Ming there's a big problem behind the identity of Captain Duncan, especially in the presence of the supernatural phenomena, the talking wooden goat head, on this ship. However, he didn't have much choice in the matter. Not only does the goat head would try to confirm his identity whenever he crosses over, but the ship itself would also occasionally do the same. This measure could only be described as insidious by the real owner. It didn't help either when the goat head on the mapping table looked like some sort of evil gargoyle from the old stories. But with the cons aside, the ship was quite amiable if he endured the Duncan Abnomar name. It's not like any of the stuff here looked very intelligent anyways. Zhou Ming, perhaps Duncan now, ended his brief contemplation in memory lane and unfolded the chart on the mapping table. There were no identifiable routes, markers, or land on the chart, not even an island. On its rough and thick parchment surface, there were instead large patches of gray-white blobs that were constantly churning and undulating to obscure the original routes mapped on the map. However, there's one image on it that didn't get muddled up, the silhouette of a ship looming in the thick fog. Duncan Zhou Ming has not much experience in setting sail using the old techniques, but even the dumbasses of modern society would know a normal chart couldn't look like this. Apparently, Like the wooden goat head on the table, the chart was some kind of supernatural object, it was just that Duncan hadn't yet summed up its use. Seemingly noticing the captain's attention had finally focused on the chart, the goat's head, which had been quiet for a long time on the table, moved again. It started to make clicking sounds like wood rubbing against wood. At first it was still restrained, but that promptly reached the point of being unignorable, of vibrating like a sex toy. Fine, say it. Duncan was afraid this seizuring darn thing would put the table on fire at this rate. Yes, Captain, I repeat, today is a good day to set sail, and the Vanished is waiting for your orders as always. Are we going to raise the sails? Chapter 3 Inches. The captain of the Vanished. The hard, black face of the wooden goat head stared up at Duncan and gleamed with an unnerving sense of expectations in those obsidian eyes, that's despite not being able to show emotions. This wasn't the first time the statue had urged him to set sail. In fact, the goat-headed figurine had done so every time he came here. It's unsettling and painful because there's always a silent murmuring from the ship to do the same. It's one reason he always returned to the apartment and didn't stay longer. Duncan didn't utter a word for a while as he darkly contemplated the issues at hand. There are two problems he has to resolve if he wants to set sail. First, he was the only one on the darn ship, and manning this giant behemoth himself was out of the question. As a wind-sailed ship, Duncan roughly estimated the Vanished at 150 to 200 meters in length, meaning it takes no less than a few dozen experienced sailors to man or 100 inexperienced ones to figure out. Second, stripping out the professional factors mentioned above, another critical problem stood in the way of his voyage. He didn't know how to drive a ship anyways, regardless of how giddy the manchild in him was behaving at the prospect. Duncan could perhaps ask the goat for advice on using the steering wheel, but the prospect of the endless yapping coming out of that mouth gave him anxiety attacks. Then again, he didn't need to ask. Perhaps by fate or some supernatural will, the goat head took the initiative to speak. Captain, do you have any concerns? If you are worried about the Vanished, rest assured that the ship is always ready to sail with you to the ends of the world. Or are you worried the voyage will be inauspicious? I know a little about divination, but what type do you believe in? Celestial signs, incense reading, and crystals are all okay too. Speaking of crystals, you remember. Duncan struggled to hold his inner urge to strangle the head right there and then. With suppressed annoyance, I'll assess the situation first up on the deck. You be quiet and stay here. As you wish, Captain. But I must remind you that the Vanished has been drifting blindly for far too long. You must take charge of it as soon as possible to get the voyage back on track, the goat head said before returning to its normal posture following a wood-rubbing sound. Peace instantly returned to Duncan's world in that second. Breathing a sigh of relief, the throbbing resonance in his brain gradually subsided as he picked up the flintlock handgun from the table and walked out of the captain's room. The rather old-looking flintlock gun he found while exploring the ship was accompanied by a one-handed sword currently hanging from his waist. They gave him confidence in moving about on the vessel, although there weren't anyone alive here in the last few days he explored. Ads by PubFuture. Talking. Items, excluded of course. The salty sea breeze hitting Duncan's face somewhat calmed his irritable mood as he subconsciously looked up to the sky. Thick clouds as far as the eye could see, no sun, no moon or stars, only a looming black cloud that never dissipates on this endless ocean. For a while, he wondered if there's ever been such a thing as a normal weather in this world at all. Then swinging around to face the captain's quarter again, Duncan saw a line inscribed on the beam above the door. He didn't recognize the letters, but once his gaze fixed on that line, he directly understood its meaning. The Door of the Lost. The Door of the Lost, the Vanished, Duncan muttered to himself, this ship has a suitable name. He then strode around and up the stairs at the edge, leading to the stern's upper deck. This part of the wooden platform had the broadest view and the black steering wheel for the helmsman. This caused a frown to form on Duncan's face. For some reason, he's got this senseless urgency to do something at the sight of the black steering wheel. This didn't happen before, only this time. As if in response to the anxiety in his heart, an unexplained, chaotic wind blew across the deck, and the initially calm sea around him was instantly flooded with waves. Although this wind and wave did not impact the huge, Vanished, Duncan was nevertheless on alert. The next second, he was staring forward at the ship's bow in surprise. There, between the chaotic and hazy ocean, an endless wall of white suddenly materialized out of thin air and caused him to pop his eyes in shock. This whiteness surrounded and isolated this world. Like a cliff connecting heaven and earth, This strange phenomenon reminded him of the same murky fog from his apartment. Worst of all, the Vanished was driving itself towards the fog. Duncan didn't know what this whiteness did or what was in the depths of it, but he instinctively sensed danger with the firm notion he didn't want to go there. Subconsciously rushing over to spot where the wheel was, he wanted to do something, anything. Unfortunately, a sense of great helplessness gripped his figure once he got to the helm. He still didn't know how to drive this ship. Ads by PubFuture. Then when he least expected it, a familiar voice came from the copper pipe next to the wheel. It's connected to the captain's quarter down below, where the goat head sat, and its tone was unusually unnerved and frantic. "Captain, there is a border collapse up ahead, and we are approaching the limits of reality. Please adjust the course now." Listening to the frantic voice of the goat head, Duncan almost broke out yelling. He wouldn't be standing here acting all helpless if it was so easy to adjust course. There's no one else to help him, for God's sake. Then he realized something, which only made him even sadder. Forget about adjusting course. The truth was, those masts in front of him were nothing but poles without a single sail. For the first time in days, he had voluntarily placed his hand on the steering wheel in acceptance. Under these strange and dire circumstances, he had no energy left to resist the urging that constantly haunted his sanity. But then, in his blank state of hollowness, a great something incredible happened on this ghost ship. The sound of a mountainous roaring exploded inside Duncan's mind. As if tens of thousands of cheering men were standing on the shore to send him off for the maiden voyage, he got a strange notion that he was no longer alone but surrounded by working sailors on board shouting out commands in the captain's name. Even weirder, he could hear the iconic Merry Pirate song in his ear. Yo ho, a pirate's life for me. We pillage, we plunder, we rifle, and loot. Drink up, me, hearties, yo ho. We kidnap and ravage and don't give a hoot. Drink up me, hearties, yo ho. While his mind tried to wrap around the strange phenomenon, something weirder occurred. A green flame caught his attention from the edge of his vision. Looking down, it was coming from his palm that's holding the steering wheel of the Vanished. Then before he knew it, the small blob of ghostly fire had spread across his whole body. November LBJNN. Under this satanic ritual, his flesh and blood transformed, turning hollow and illusory, and his uniform became worn and ragged like it's soaked in the sea for hundreds of years. He's not even human anymore, but a ghost captain with coursing flames is blood and flesh with a skeletal figure of unquenchable death. Yet, despite the change, he did not feel the slightest pain from his loss. Rather, his perception widened as the ghost fire continued to sweep across the ship. First the helm, then over deck, then across the mast to form intertwined netted sails to give life to this vessel. The Vanished has finally started sailing again, continuing on its long voyage with an unknown destination. Chapter 4 Inches Ship of the Spirit World. It turns out Duncan didn't need a crew at all, because as long as he, the captain, was at the helm, the Vanished could set sail at any time. Of course, he did get briefly frightened by the ghostly green flame as it rose into the air and started doing weird things, but that fear paled in comparison to the thought of not gaining control. So, his hand turned into a death grip around the wheel and refused to let go. He's not stupid. Duncan had figured out by now the green flame was some kind of harmless force. Whether or not he could recover his body later was a question for later. But at least for now, the flame was helping him, and he needed it badly. Soon, the tsunami of cheers faded, and Duncan found his mind in a state of absolute clarity, with the ship becoming an extension of himself. Although he still didn't have the knowledge and experience of a qualified captain, controlling the Vanished to move as he pleased was no longer an issue. First, he tried turning the wheel and got real feedback from the force inside his head. It was telling him the hull had begun turning as he intended. However, the speed at which the Vanished was turning didn't seem to be enough, and that got reaffirmed by the screeching cry of the goat head through the copper pipe next to himself. Attention, we are fast approaching the limit of reality, we're about to fall into the spiritual world. Captain, we need. I'm doing it, Duncan yelled and cut off the goat head's cry. Instead of making noise down below, how about you think of something to help? The goat head went momentarily quiet, but just when Duncan thought the other party had finally stopped, the copper pipe suddenly came back with a hoarse and somewhat creepy cheer. Fight. Fight, fight. Duncan, talk about having reality crash down on his head. Duncan could accept coming to a ghost ship, becoming a ghost captain, and being stewed by a ghostly green fire, but what's this, cheerleading? The goat head had always given him a dangerous and spooky feeling like that of an evil gargoyle, but now that creepy and scary figurine just became a la-la, pom-pom cheerleader. WTF. But the fast-approaching fog didn't give Duncan time or chance to think about it. Although the vanished had begun to turn rapidly, it was still no match for the gaining fog on their rear, and soon, the fog had enveloped the area surrounding the ship. Ads by PubFuture. Something strange was definitely taking place in the surrounding environment at that moment. The sky had become particularly dim, and the original blue sea water had now been riddled with wisps of black lines entangling itself like a hairnet. Before long, the blue water had turned into a sea of black water as countless shadowy things emerged. We have fallen into the spirit world. The loud and eerie cheering from the goat stopped then. Instead, it had become mixed up with a spooky cohort of other voices in the background. But the vanished isn't completely lost. Captain, take the helm before we sink further into the deep sea. If we maintain course, then the vanished can still get out. The premise is that I know where to go. Duncan growled menacingly due to the crackling green flames mixed into his voice. I've lost my sense of direction. Intuition, Captain, intuition. The voice of the goat head shouted through the copper pipe again. Your intuition is more accurate than the markings on the chart. Quote. A feeling of powerlessness surged into his heart. Duncan had no extra strength left to argue with an evil goat head. Since the figurine said he had to rely on intuition, then he might as well get reckless. Following the last tinge of intuition, before the fog blinded his view, he grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and turned it as hard as he could in the direction he believed. From top to bottom, the vanished issued out a long series of stressing sounds from the hull as the vessel drove in an arc across the Black Sea. Then suddenly, as the wind howled and the fog swirled around him, Duncan's eyes caught the emerging glimpse of something. It was a ship, a white vessel that looked smaller than the vanished with a dark chimney in the middle of the hull. As it so happens, the two vessels were on a perfect collision course with one another. Duncan's inner curse words, motherfucking chicken dinner. I'm going to sink inside the spirit world. He had explored this strange world for so long without seeing a living soul, yet he does so that he could die by crashing at sea. What are the odds? N-O-V-E in .c ohm. Ads by PubFuture. As the wind howled and the waves raged, the boundless sea unleashed its terrifying might upon this world. In the face of this natural and mighty force, all would feel minuscule before it. For the unfortunate enough like the White Oak to be the bearer of bad news, the ship was currently being squeezed of its last ounce of power from those steam turbines to fight against what would ultimately be death if they failed. The gray-haired captain, Lawrence Creed, stood in the wheelhouse of the White Oak. Despite the sturdy walls and glass windows around him, these superficial barriers did not give him any sense of security. Instead, he could hear the whining stress of mechanical gears battering against one another, which worried him as he gripped the wheel. Even worse, the ever-encroaching fog on top of the enormous waves frightened him. The White Oak was the most advanced steamship in the current world, but even the most advanced machinery could only ensure the ship survived the normal sea. Beyond the murky fog, ahead was what they called the border of reality, the unknown in which evil gods lurked. Captain, the pastor can't hold on anymore. The first mate's mournful shouts came from the side. Lawrence could hear the slightly muffled echo from the other's voice, indicating something was awfully going wrong. Then looking forward to where the prayer table had been set up, an ominous purple-black flame had burst forward from the incense, and the honorable cleric they brought along for the journey was frothing in the mouth. The guy was not well, and the nosebleeds and shivering only meant he was fighting whatever foul taint was invading his soul. Captain, the first mate's voice came from the side again but got cut off by Lawrence's following order. Temporarily close the holy emblem marker. We'll dive into the spirit world. The first mate was momentarily stunned, and the man who had spent half his life at sea seemed unable to believe his ears. Captain. Sink into the spirit world. We can spend 10 minutes there and escape the fiercest wave of the border collapse. This will give our priest a chance to recover. Lawrence ordered again with a commanding voice, obey my orders, now. The first mate's jaw moved but then gritted his teeth and complied, yes, Captain. The crew began to carry out the orders in quick and precise strides, leaving Lawrence to get a breather and focus on the big picture. The sense of protection from the holy relic had started to recede following his order, and they were quickly sinking into the spirit world, a space between reality and the deep sea. It was dangerous to do this, but historically, there are cases of ships returning from that place. As a member of the explorers, association, he had read numerous texts on the subject and various survival guides written by survivors to prove it possible. How bad could it be, right? He only needed to let the white oak dodge the storm at the edge of the spirit world and then use the surging power output of the advanced steam turbine to carry out a thrilling spirit drift. Then, if luck still cared for him, he could lead his crew back to the human world. Afterward, he only needs to hand over the dam, Anomaly 099, in storage to the officials of the city-state of Plant. From then on, he swore he would never get mixed up with this business again. Things couldn't get worse. Lawrence tries to comfort himself by muttering this until he sees the three-masted galleon larger than the White Oak. The other ship had suddenly emerged on the surface of the sea, and it was charging head-on into them like an indomitable beast. Chapter 5 Inches intertwined. At this moment, everyone aboard the White Oak would describe what they saw as something they would never forget in a lifetime. It was an old and majestic three-masted warship, in an age when steamships were no longer unusual. The old-styled galleon that emerged from the thick fog was a thing out of an old oil painting. Burning green flames spanned across the wooden hull, and the sails were so overpowering and ghostly that they struck a chord of the undead kind. "We're going to crash," some crew members shouted. They are not one to shy away from danger, but this was too much for their mortal souls. While most ran around like headless chickens looking for a place to hide, some stayed and grasped onto whatever they could find. However, a few had begun to pray and chant to the storm goddess Gomona or the lord of death Bartok. In this boundless sea, the blessings of the gods may have waned, but only the power of these two gods granted some form of protection for their souls. But not all the crew members were losing their cool. The first mate had set his eyes on the captain, someone whom he trusted the most. Dangers always accompanied the endless sea, and in dire situations like these, the captain's experience always determined the life and death of its crew. Since Captain Lawrence had over 30 years of experience, he's the best bet anyone could make. Unfortunately, to the first mate's disappointment, there's only fear and shock on the captain's face right now. Acting as if he's completely unaware of the danger coming at the White Oak, the old captain stared so hard at the emerging galleon that he nearly snapped off the wheel. It's the Vanished. Ads by PubFuture. CA, Captain. The first mate got startled by the name. Like everyone who made a living on the sea, he's heard many stories from older and more superstitious sailors. What did you just say? That. The Vanished. Captain Lawrence did not seem to hear his first mate's cry and continued to stare ahead. By the time he regained any semblance of control, the White Oak had already plowed into the Vanished. Almost all the sailors screamed, but the expected earth-shattering crash did not come. Instead, the burning green ship of ghostly nature directly went into the White Oak's body and intertwined with each other. This naturally drew wide eyes from the crew, who were still trembling all over from the contact. Lawrence also watched this happen, but when his eyes caught sight of his first mate in front of himself, the man had transformed into an ethereal body as the flame engulfed the guy. As for the priest next to the praying table, the flames didn't consume the cleric, but instead bounced off the flickering white blessing protecting him. Then the flames devoured the old captain as well. A powerful sense of weariness, obedience, and fear filled his whole body. This activated the protective sea charm he prepared ahead of time, allowing Lawrence to maintain some part of his sanity while he passed through the moving ghost ship's hull and cabins. There were ancient wooden pillars of burning green fire in there, rotten ropes and barnacles, and a vast storage room housing all sorts of strange things that should have been lying deep under the sea. But things changed when he entered the captain's quarter of the Vanished. It was luxurious by any standards, but the wooden goat head figurine ruined any sense of wealth with its ominous presence. Twisted and glowing, the goat head stared indifferently into Lawrence's eyes like it was watching prey. Eventually, Lawrence couldn't take it anymore from the intense glare and flinched upwards. That's when the two captains met. Tall and cursed-looking as one might expect, Duncan was still holding the steering wheel of the Vanished with his imposing self of ghostly nature. The old Lawrence knew this was it. Closing his eyes in resignation, the old sailor understood the Vanished had come for its booty, and they were that prize. Ads by PubFuture. You don't have to take everyone away. Take me and let my crew go. He shot open his eyes and mustered enough courage to make any parent proud. But the tall ghostly figure did not answer him but instead cast a curious gaze at whatever small mortal captain whom dared to bargain with himself. They all have wives and children. Lawrence shouts in desperation. The flaming undead finally reacted and began to move that jaw like it was saying something. Unfortunately, the loud whistling wind around them had utterly overtaken the sentence in the ears of the mortals. "What did you say? The wind is too strong for me to hear. No, vel, b, in dot c, ohm." The next second, a loud noise blasted into Lawrence's ears, mixed in with the wind and cries of the sailors outside. Finally, "It's over." The green flame had faded away under the afterglow of the light, and the remaining hull of the Vanished had dissipated into the murky fog behind the white oak. Gasping at the release, Lawrence immediately checked his body and found everything had returned to normal. The flesh that burned off had returned, and the priest lying next to the praying table was still breathing heavily. "They're all alive. Captain, the ship, the Vanished is gone," the first mate yelled with an incredible voice. Lawrence was distracted and delayed his response. "Did he let us go?" The first mate didn't hear him clearly and asked again, "Captain, what did you say?" "That Captain Duncan," Lawrence muttered subconsciously, but then slapped himself as if he had accidentally mentioned some forbidden word. Jerking up to face his first mate, "Fast, roll call the entire crew. I want to see who's missing from the White Oak." The first mate immediately nodded and was ready to carry out the order when Lawrence added another sentence, "And make sure to see if there's anyone extra on the ship." The first mate got taken aback by the second half but promptly understood with intense fear in those eyes. He kept whispering the storm goddess's name while he turned for the deck and rang the gathering bell. Chapter 6 Inches Missing Cargo. While the sailors assembled with their chaotic footsteps, Lawrence and his second mate first went ahead to help the priest up into a better position. Then looking out the window, the old captain saw they were still in the thick of the fog and far from safety. Nevertheless, the sight of that terrifying ghost ship being gone was enough to satisfy him for now. Next, he must determine exactly what the Vanished took from the White Oak, or what it left behind. And it must be determined as shortly as possible. He simply did not dare to let the ship back into the real world without ruling out all the hidden dangers. There are things, if brought, would cause catastrophic damage to the real world. On the contrary, he also didn't want to extend their stay in the spirit world lest there be an irreversible effect on his crew. Eventually the noise from above deck brought him back from his thoughts. Looking up to examine the holy cleric and the incense burner, he asks with concern in his voice, "Mr. Ron, how stable are we right now?" The priest heaved incessantly as he coughed like those who's been stricken with illness. Then taking out a compass from his chest pocket, the priest etches some sort of sacred symbol with his finger at the air and silently chants a spell to make the arrow spin until it stops at a certain position. "We're floating somewhere in between the surface and the spirit world, slightly closer to the real world, so the influence of the depths is minimal." The priest then got all confused after staring down at the compass arrow. "Strange, we are completely stable here despite the relic being turned off. We're not sinking at all. Oomph, oomph. Maybe the collision of the Vanished actually knocked us onto a safe route." Lawrence shook his head with a wry smile, trying to enliven the mood with a bad joke. "I heard there are some delicate balance points in the spirit world that can keep us from being pulled into the deeper parts." "Mr. Captain, this joke is bad even for you," said the priest with a grin before breaking out in more wheezing coughs. "In any case, what happened today must be reported to the church. The appearance of the Vanished is no small matter. There have been sightings of the Vanished for decades in the past, but never have we been able to confirm it like this. Oh, bless the goddess for keeping us safe. Captain, you and your crew need to be psychologically prepared for when we return to planned. None of you will be able to sail again in the near future." "You do not need to remind me, Mr. Ron. I understand the authorities and the church will not want a ship that's suffered the visit of the Vanished to leave their sight so quickly. For the safety of all, I intend to make a report to both parties and the Explorers Association. Alas, I also need to make a report to my terrible wife. I'm sure she will have quite the tongue lashing for me when I get back." Captain Lawrence pressed his forehead hard, and after a long sigh he waved the pain away. "Without further ado, you need to rest now, and until we return to port, this ship needs the blessing of the goddess." The priest nodded at that, and soon the first mate had returned to the cabin as well. Ads by PubFuture. "There are no missing aboard, and there are no new people," the first mate reported as soon as they met without waiting for the captain's question. "I personally examined the sailors assembled on deck and went to the boiler room to check the mechanics who remained there. They could all accurately pronounce the names of the gods they believed in." "Not a single one." Lawrence's eyes widened in surprise. This should have been good news, but he couldn't believe things would be so well. "What about the holy relic?" "The relic is functioning as normal." The first mate nodded at once, the navigator is preparing incense and essential oils for burning. We await your orders, Captain. Lawrence listened in disbelief and once again couldn't stop muttering, did he really spare our ship? Good luck is in our favor, Captain. The first mate spreads his hands, we didn't lose anyone. Perhaps that ghost captain only happens to pass by and our encounter is an accident. Do you believe this yourself? Lawrence immediately glanced at his first mate with a face, if good luck really favors us, we wouldn't have met at all. Halfway through his words, a rush of footsteps suddenly sounded outside before the cabin door swung open. A sweaty sailor promptly came before Lawrence with a look of dread. Captain, Anomaly 099 is missing. There was an instant silence in the cab, and everyone was looking at each other. Somehow though, Lawrence only got a sense of relief at this news. This is too great, we've finally found the problem on the ship. But then he controlled the expression on his face and strode out the cabin with his first mate at the wheel. The old captain must confirm this immediately as he led the way forward to the deepest part of the steamship. Soon, a special cabin came before their eyes. The door of this cabin had dense occult symbols engraved on the frame, and the whole piece seems to be forged from black iron. The whole setup acted like a closed-off cage meant to preserve whatever's held inside. Ads by PubFuture. Lawrence first confirmed there was no damage to the symbols on the door, then looked up again towards the relic room, one level above this one. This arrangement was to make sure the content of 009 wouldn't pollute the rest of the ship and drag them, deep, into the sea. But it was in such an arrangement, where both barrier and insurance remained intact, that the critical cargo escorted by the White Oak went missing. Lawrence inhaled deeply and unsealed the lock, pushing the heavy iron door inward with force. Inside the sealed room, the lights were bright, and the gas lamps hanging on the 4 columns illuminated the center with no blind spots to see. Yet, the goods that should have been here had disappeared, leaving only a few crisscrossing chains and some gray-white ashes scattered on the surrounding floorboard. The lead deckhand's voice spoke from behind, according to the seal requirements of Anomaly 099. The room was always lit, and every 2 hours, a crew member would come in to reinforce the chains around the coffin and sprinkle ashes on the floor. But when the ghost ship appeared, because of the chaos, the sailor who was supposed to be on duty did not enter the room in time. It was almost 7 minutes late when we discovered 99's disappearance. Just 7 minutes won't cause that thing to get out of control. The seals we placed here aren't for decoration. At worst, the coffin would only be able to move about in the room. Lawrence frowned and shook his head, we know it's missing for sure and has left the ship. This is not the fault of the sailor. The deckhand appears a little nervous, then your meaning is. It must be the vanished, Lawrence said in a deep voice, and the captain took Anomaly 099 with him. Speaking of this, he paused and sighed softly, perhaps we should be thankful that the vanished only wanted that thing only and didn't take any of our lives. NOVELBJN.C. Ohm. The deckhand met his captain's gaze, then around the empty seal room, he finally spoke with hesitancy, but, how will we tell the authorities that we lost their important cargo? Lawrence didn't get fazed by the mention and patted the man's shoulder. The vanished is a natural disaster, and we have maritime insurance. Does the insurance company pay for this? If they won't, then we will ask the Explorers Association to issue a new bounty for the vanished. Captain, aren't you a little? Shut up. Chapter 7 Inches Doll. After confirming from the goat head that the vanished had left the dangerous sea and could sail on its own, Duncan took his hand off the dark and heavy wheel and turned to examine himself. His body had regained its flesh, and the deck restored to its original state without the green flame. But in a mysterious and inexorably way, he felt that many things were different now. He could feel that something had changed the moment he grasped the helmsman of the vanished, that the green flame had connected him to the ship and even to the sea itself. Take the floorboards beneath his feet for example, it's become a part of him, an extension of his feet. Closing his eyes slowly, Duncan taps into his newfound extensions for a swing. He could still hear the creepy murmurs of nothingness coming from the vanished, the newly lit white embers of flame in the captain's quarter, and the battering waves against the ship's hull. However, he discovered one thing that wasn't there before, a sense of being watched by some dark shadows. When he tried to locate where this was coming from, the other side immediately backed away and disappeared. Opening his eyes again, he heaves a soft sigh and summons up the ghostly sails on the mast. From this point forwards, he's truly become the ship's captain. There's no turning back after he made the decision to helm the wheel. Captain, We are floating up from the edge of the spirit world and will soon return to the real world. The voice of the goat head came from the side, but it was not through the copper pipe used for communication on the ship but directly inside Duncan's mind. Thankfully the goat stopped being so annoying when talking about serious businesses. Our luck is quite good. The deepest we went was at the bottom of the spirit world, so the ship isn't affected in any way. The real world, the spiritual sea, the deep sea, and the subspace that seems to be even deeper than the previous three. Duncan didn't know what these strange words were exactly, nor did he know their true meaning, only that it's popping up in his head and an indication of what was happening in this world. Nevertheless, one thing's certain in Duncan's mind. Whenever the goat head called himself Captain, the attitude from the gargoyle figurine changed. Though subtle, but changed. In fact, Duncan was so certain that if he revealed himself to be Zhou Ming, right now, a man from another world, the goat head would still obey his orders regardless of the truth. But after a little hesitation, he backed down and didn't want to test this theory, nor did he ask the goat about the spirit world, deep sea, and subspace. Sure, a few days ago, he was anxious and uneasy about being here, but the situation no longer made him insecure and worried. Ads by PubFuture. For one thing, there are other people in this world, other ships, and other civilizations. This gave him hope and a vague idea for his future plans. That ship was mechanically powered, and the Vanished is more like an old-styled sail galleon warship from the previous era. Duncan muttered to himself and began brainstorming, but not entirely mechanical either. There are some cabins of unknown significance on that ship, and the cabins were arranged as if they were some kind of sacrificial site with many strange patterns and symbols etched along the walls. Goat head, Duncan said suddenly inside his brain. He did not know the goat head's name, so he called this out subconsciously. When I was passing through that ship just now, the man who looked like a captain shouted at me. What did he say? The goat's head seemed indifferent to being addressed in such a manner and gladly accepted the name. The wind and waves are too big to hear clearly. You didn't hear either. Duncan frowned. I get the feeling from his expression that he's ready to die a tragic death with me or something. It must have been really important for him to call out to me at that moment. It's normal for humans to react in that manner before you, Captain. This is especially true for sailors, so it's no surprise. Don't worry, Captain, a tree need not heed the cries of a grasshopper. The goat head replied as if it were a matter of course, but Duncan almost tripped over from the news. Wanting to die with me is a normal reaction for humans. He immediately regretted the sentence after uttering it aloud. It's inappropriate and would expose the flaw in his identity as the captain. However, the same couldn't be said for the goat head, which continued to act oblivious to the oddity in Duncan's behavior. It is normal that they fear you. The tone of the goat head now sounded proud. Anyone who sails on the boundless sea should fear you, just as they fear the gods of old and the shadows of subspace. Speaking of shadows, did you know a brilliant engineer, or it could have also been an agronomist or a foodie, the person once said something. Duncan sensibly did not take up the topic because he was worried that he would not be able to continue the topic. Of course, the most important reason remains to be the goat head's endless battering. If he caters to his talk, the annoyance will rise exponentially. What is this thing? Duncan smartly changed the topic and asked with amazement. There's something outside the captain's quarter. Ads by PubFuture. It was a wooden box more than a man's length. The artistry looks to be very well made with riveted and gold-plated reinforcement. There are also intricate patterns etched along the surface like some sort of hieroglyphic symbols. For sure, this box definitely wasn't on the Vanished before. The voice of the goat head went silent for a moment before sounding again. I don't know, but it should be some sort of booty. Booty. Duncan didn't know how to react for a moment and walked around the box twice. This thing looks like a coffin, but it's much more exquisite than an ordinary coffin. Wait, booty, you mean this thing was taken from that ship? A successful hunt, Captain, the goat head said in a serious yet complimenting voice. It is expected that the Vanished return with some booty after a voyage. Duncan subconsciously dropped his jaws in shock. What success? He had no intention of taking anything from the other ship to begin with. But thinking about it, saying what he thought wouldn't conform to his captain image, and more importantly, the mechanical ship had disappeared into the thick of the fog. Then recalling the white-bearded captain's death glare and the stuff about dying with him, Duncan understood he'd much rather take his chances with this box. Coming closer to this suspicious coffin, he finally noticed the lid. It's loosened by something and opened beforehand. Though hesitant, he placed his hand on the wooden box. At least, he needed to figure out how that spirit world ship placed this item here. Stronger than he had imagined, his hand easily lifted the lid off after a little shove. There, lying inside, shocked him. A person. In the wooden box, quietly lay a beautiful young woman, long silver white hair spread like liquid mercury in the box. Her appearance could only be described as exquisite and flawless, and she was faintly carrying a certain noble and detached temperament with that gorgeous purplish-black court dress. A sleeping doll. No wait, this is really a doll. On closer inspection, Duncan suddenly noticed the inhuman joint structure of the other party. Chapter 8 Inches the Sun. A doll, so delicate that Duncan could hardly distinguish it from a real human being at first glance. In fact, it's as if the doll would come alive at any second now. But this was just an illusion on his part. The doll wouldn't and remained completely unresponsive to its surroundings. But after a long wary observation, Duncan finally came to the decision the gorgeous goth doll in the box wouldn't suddenly jump up to surprise himself, which was slightly relieving on his part. Then he frowned and asked the goat head again, "What do you think of this situation?" "This must have been an important cargo escorted by the previous ship," replied the goat head at once. Though it had previously stated that it did not know about the strange wooden coffin that had suddenly appeared on deck, it was clearly more experienced with the affairs of the sea than Duncan. There are symbols pointing to the gods, and the box is surrounded by pins to secure chains in place. This all indicate that the thing was sealed at some point. To transport something sealed on the boundless sea is a very risky thing to do, so I believe that ship we encountered must have some background to attempt such a ordeal. Seal. Duncan's eyes twitched at the idea. If the coffin had been sealed before coming aboard the Vanished, wouldn't that mean whatever's inside had been unsealed now? Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to remove the lid so easily. For the ordinary and fragile person, this might be dangerous. However, it's of no threat to you if it could be sealed by some special skill. Captain, you are far more dangerous than this anomaly. Adds by PubFuture. Duncan was speechless and became tied inside over the thought of him being more dangerous than a creepy coffin on the ship. It didn't help either when the one flattering him was an evil and spooky gargoyle figurine with a goat face. After sighing in his heart that he still needed to be cautious in gathering knowledge, Duncan frowned some more and looked at the doll one last time before making up his mind. I should throw this back into the sea. There was a hint of hesitation in his heart when he said this, especially when looking at the doll. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. This wasn't due to the doll being too beautiful, but rather because it's too realistic looking. A sleeping beauty like in the Snow White story. Who could bear to do such a thing? But this hesitation eventually strengthened his resolve. As a rational and cautious person, he could not leave such a potential danger next to himself, especially when this world had so many unnatural and strange things. What if this doll was one of those strange things? Having the goat head was enough, he didn't need to add a second anomaly to his troubles. Covering up the coffin with the lid again, Duncan made sure to find a hammer and nailed it tight for safe measures. Finally, he pushed the coffin, with the doll inside, to the edge of the deck. Adds by PubFuture. You can dispose of your booty at will, Captain, but I will still make a respectful and humble suggestion. You don't need to be so cautious. The Vanished hadn't added any loot to its treasure trove for a long time, the goat says in his head. Shut up. Duncan simply cut off the annoyance and kicked the coffin hard. The heavy box teetered a bit at the edge of the deck before falling straight into the sea, which had returned to its normal dullish blue color, and made a huge splash at impact. Not relieved yet, Duncan made sure the box left his view completely before issuing out a sigh of relief. Then looking around, he confirmed the fog had mostly dissipated as well, indicating the Vanished had detached itself from the spirit world, and returned to the real world. Duncan immediately scanned around for signs of the steamship. According to his estimation, it shouldn't have been too long since the two ships met, meaning it could still be within visual view. But he found nothing, not even a faded shape of the steamship. Is this also because of this strange sea? Or is it related to the so-called spirit voyage? Duncan muttered in his heart, but soon his attention was drawn to something else. He saw a glimmer of light in the depths of the clouds above the sea that had never dispersed before. As if a thick drapery had been lifted from his world, the sea surface now glistened like one would expect from a morning rise. This picture emotionally touched Duncan's heart. Ever since he learned of this side's existence, he hadn't seen the sun since being trapped in his apartment. And now, he finally got to welcome the sun with open arms again. But it didn't happen. The expected warmth of the morning rise didn't come, Instead, he saw a golden sphere that left him utterly frozen on the spot. The light was in no way as dazzling as he expected. The sun was a round radiant orb of yellow, but circling around it were two concentrical rings of intricate runes that gave off the impression of a shackle binding its prisoner. "What's that?" he spoke softly with a low and somewhat cold voice. "That's the sun, of course, Captain." The voice of the goat head was as calm as ever. Chapter 9 Inches Return and Return. Duncan didn't know how long he had been staring at the sky, but he eventually withdrew his eyes from the clouds after becoming unbearably sore. However, the image of the sun remained deeply imprinted in his retina despite closing them. The sun wasn't supposed to be like that, but now, he had to accept the facts. He was in a foreign land, a place farther away than he could ever have imagined. Subconsciously turning his head back towards the door to the captain's quarter, Duncan knew he could go back to the apartment room where he's lived for so many years. But there's nothing there for him. Aside from the thick, murky grayish fog, what could he accomplish on that side from the 30 or so square feet of space? In reality, the home that he deemed familiar was no more than another lonely boat, metaphorically speaking, of course. In the long silence, the voice of the goat head came again and broke his moping. "Captain, where are we going next? Do you have any sailing plans in mind?" Sailing plans? How could Duncan have that kind of thing? Although he was eager to immediately formulate a perfect plan to explore the world and finalize the next voyage, he didn't have the slightest clue nor the knowledge to charter a route on the map. In fact, merely driving the Vanished had only come to him a few hours ago. Nevertheless, he still pondered the idea before replying. "Where did the ship that collided with us come from?" "You mean those city-states? Which one do you wish to go?" The voice of the goat head was a little surprised and then wanted to dissuade him. "I suggest that you not go near the shipping lanes controlled by those city-states, at least not now. Despite you being the great Captain Duncan, the current state of the Vanished is not as good as before. The garrisons patrolling those waters will certainly resist your offensive." Duncan became speechless for a while. He wanted to know what the real Captain Duncan could have done to warrant such hatred. Ads by PubFuture. Also, the euphemism from the goat head revealed to Duncan that the ship was never as well maintained as he initially thought. Perhaps the main reason the ghost ship was on a long voyage had been due to the fear of returning to port in the civilized world. Duncan was a little distressed. He urgently needs to find a way to understand the world, and he must find a way to contact the civilized society out there. Whether it was for his own survival in the long term or the mystery of finding a way to return home, he must figure out a way to stop this endless wandering. The issue was that the civilized society didn't seem to welcome him to the point that his very presence was enough to aggro a 25-man raiding party to banish him to the abyss. Sighing at his own misfortune, Duncan wished there was at least a book on the Vanished at this moment. He lacks information, and the only source was the goat head. But then again, how come there is not even a book on this great ship? Sailing a long journey can be a stressful environment out at sea. That's why they always had some means to relieve themselves, like reading or movies. Can the real Duncan be illiterate? Duncan casually asked this aloud since he couldn't help himself. Unexpectedly, the goat answered without hesitation, "Books. Reading at sea is a dangerous thing. The shadows in the depths and the ones hiding in the subspace are all waiting for the mortal mind to show an opening. The classics from the church are fine, but those are so boring that it's better to wash the deck." "But Captain, haven't you always been uninterested in the things from the church?" Duncan immediately raised an eyebrow over the news. How can reading a book at sea be life-threatening? Only the scriptures from the church are fine. What sort of sickness down this boundless sea have? He got a little more knowledge about this world, but at the same time, he also got more questions about its makeup. Suppressing his desire to ask again, he came before the ship's side and stared into the distant horizon. If discounting the eerie appearance of the sun shining down on the rippling water surface, this glistening sparkle of the sea would indeed be considered beautiful. "I'd like to hear your advice," Duncan said cautiously to the goat head. "I'm a little tired of this aimless voyage, perhaps." Halfway through his words, a strange feeling suddenly swept up from the bottom of his heart, and this feeling came from the connection between him and the Vanished. It's as if some foreign object suddenly touched the ship before he heard a bang noise in the direction of the stern. Duncan frowned, then pulled out the flintlock handgun and one-handed pirate saber from his waist. He wasted no time and ran over to check where he saw something lying quietly on deck. It was the ornate wooden coffin with the weird doll again. A creepy feeling welled up in Duncan's head. From what he saw, the box was still wet from floating in the seawater, but more importantly, the nails he used to make sure the lid was sealed had been pried off. After several minutes of vigilant confrontation, Duncan finally made up his mind. Clutching the flintlock gun in one hand and the saber in the other, he used the blade tip to push the partially cracked lid aside with force. The Gothic doll comes into view with an audible creak. It's still as lifeless and beautiful as before. Duncan stared at the thing for several seconds, then spoke in a deep and serious voice he believed to be commanding at the time, "If you are alive, then get up and talk to me." After saying it twice in a row, the doll still didn't move. Duncan made a deep frown before finally lightening up his voice. "Very well, that leaves me no choice but to toss you back overboard." After saying this, he did not hesitate to cover the lid again and then took the tools to nail the coffin up with even more vigor and nails. This time, he grabbed some iron chains he found in a corner to keep it secured firmly. Clapping his hand in satisfaction once confirmed he'd done it properly, Duncan nods at the handiwork and circles the box several times. "I like to see you get out of it this time." Without hesitation, he kicked the box into the sea again. Ads by PubFuture, sighing a breath of relief as he watched the box float away. He was ready to move on after waiting a minute when he snapped around with his head. "Maybe I should have strapped a cannonball to it or something," Duncan muttered and then turned away for real this time. "You're a little harsh on that lady." The sound of the goat head came into his head. "Shut up, how can you call a cursed doll, lady? It does look like a cursed doll, but what curse on the vast sea can compare to the vanished and its great Captain Duncan?" "Captain, that lady is quite gentle and harmless in fact." "Duncan, why is this goat head so proud when it comes to the curse and notoriety of the vanished and Captain Duncan?" Perhaps sensing that Duncan was in a bad mood, the goat head immediately changed the subject. "Captain, you said you wanted to hear my advice before, specifically. Let's talk about it later. I need to take a break. I lost my energy by sailing the vanished in the spirit world before, so you should be quiet." "Yes, Captain." Duncan returned to the captain's quarters and sat in front of the mapping table where the chart remained. The next second, his gaze suddenly froze. The chart seemed to have undergone a subtle change. The grayish-white patches that had originally covered the entire drawing, as if they were constantly squirming, seemed to have dissipated a little, and the sea surface around the vanished was becoming clearer. Is this map updating the surrounding water's information in real time as the vanished sails? This immediately got Duncan's full attention. However, his concentration was soon interrupted. In the depths of his soul, the vanished once again sent a signal of contact with a foreign object, before his ears heard the loud bang from the deck. Chapter 10 inches not so elegant anymore. The coffin has returned. On the aft of the vanished, Duncan looked expressionlessly at the gorgeous wooden box lying quietly in front of himself. The droplets of water on the edge leaking next to his feet confirmed he wasn't dreaming. He really did throw the darn thing into the sea not long ago. Such a strange situation was enough to make anyone feel the chills, but somehow Duncan's mood at the moment was calmer than he had imagined. Perhaps it's due to already being on the eerie ghost ship, or because he had recently experienced a thrilling drift into the spirit world, and a collision with a steamboat, or perhaps it's due to the evil-looking goat head for several days. Regardless, Duncan seemed to have grown an immunity to strange supernatural phenomena in this world. In fact, as early as the last time he threw this cursed doll into the sea, he had vaguely guessed that things wouldn't end so easily. He lowered his head, not surprisingly noticing that the iron nails and chains were gone, then used the tip of his pirate blade to pry open the lid again. The gorgeous Gothic doll still lay quietly in the center of the red velvet lining, hands folded, idyllic and elegant. But this time Duncan clearly noticed that the corners of the other side's skirt seemed to have traces of being wet by the sea with a faint smell of the ocean from inside the coffin. Up to now, this strange doll does not seem to have any other out-of-line or dangerous behavior except the back and forth, but just the going and returning was already enough to attribute it to what they call a cursed item. Duncan watched the doll for another good while, then suddenly broke the silence with a smirk. "I suddenly want to satisfy my curiosity." When the words ended, he turned and walked to the entrance of the cabin not far away and left the doll alone on the deck. Although he was wary of the doll and did not want to leave the other party by his side, but Duncan had confidence the many living creatures on the ship would be enough to deal with anything that might arise. And he has some preparations to make during this time. Duncan crossed the aft of the deck, opened the wooden door leading to the lower deck, stepped onto the wooden staircase that was God knows how old, and came to the cabin under the deck, which belonged to the upper cabin, where the cannons, powder kegs, and iron balls were placed. As he swept his gaze over the things that looked quite old at a glance, an idea suddenly came to his mind. Can these cannons reload themselves too and fire when he wills it? What about the freshwater tanks on board? Did they also refill on their own? What about the damaged places during a battle? Are they also self-repairing? Or rather, does this ship even have the concept of damage? The questions came out one by one, but he couldn't think of an explanation for any one of them. Duncan knew very well that he knew too little about the ship. Although he had explored it to some extent over the past few days, he only had a general understanding of its superstructure. Those deeper areas were far too eerie and menacing for him to explore with the limited time he had on hand. But now, the possibilities were riling up his curiosity to a new high. This was his ship, and he deserves to know about the vanished. This may be a change largely due to him taking control of that steering wheel, but he didn't know that. Shaking his head, the guy left the idea of exploration for another time and returned to his initial plan. No-vel-b in .c ohm. Ads by PubFuture. Armed with several iron shell balls, Duncan returned to the aft of the deck and made a peculiar face. Did she make any movement? Not at all, came the voice of the goat head at once. That sounded far too similar to someone that's been muffled for far too long. This lady is as quiet as she looks, and you should trust my judgment that she is completely harmless to you. Since she keeps coming back on board, it may indicate there is a connection between her and the vanished. A great horticulturist once said. Shut up, okay. Ignoring the thumping annoyance in his veins, Duncan stared expressionlessly at the doll in the coffin. I don't know if she really can't move, or if she's still pretending to be asleep, but regardless, I'm going to find out. Solid cast iron was particularly heavy, and when executing traders on a ship, a single cannonball strapped to the leg was the best way to ensure the seasoned sailor fed the fishes. For this occasion, Duncan decides to make it 4 before returning to the lower cabin for another 4, making it a total of 8. 8 cannonballs, plenty to fill up the remaining space in the wooden box with that elegant doll sleeping at the center. Well, elegant wouldn't be the right word anymore, but creepy would definitely fit the bill. With great effort, Duncan sealed the lid off again and pushed the wooden coffin to the edge of the deck. Finally, with a spinning kick of his life, he shot the box right into the sea for the 3rd time. This time, he made sure to witness it sinking into the depths with his own eyes. The voice of the goat head came into his mind then. Captain, have you repented? If you regret throwing away the loot, the vanished can still use its anchor to salvage the box again. Although the correct use of the anchor isn't meant for that, but the anchor says it can try. Shut up. Ads by PubFuture. But I see you've been standing on the edge of the deck for a long time. Shut up. Okay. Duncan heaves a long sigh. He couldn't admit to the bootlicking goat head that his toe hurts from that spinning kick. So, with the painful sting still apparent in his shoe, he maintained the serious and majestic appearance of a captain overseeing the waters until many minutes later. Whether Duncan actually looked like a proper captain or not was one thing, but he's certain no one would mock him for it. After returning to his quarter and waiting quietly for a few more minutes, he estimated the timing should be about right and got to where the windows were. This spot was below the stern area, so he should be able to peer through the opening and see what he wanted. Captain, you are, the goat head couldn't help but ask after witnessing this odd behavior. Duncan stared intently at the sea surface and replied without looking up, I'm wondering how that cursed doll keeps coming back. Because she's a cursed doll, that's how. I appreciate your uncomprehensive attitude, but I think that even if she is a cursed doll, there must be some kind of process in her coming back on the ship. I suspect she's also able to communicate but refuses to do so. If I can grasp onto her reasoning, then perhaps we can stop this charade and get some words in. Listening to Duncan's explanation, the goat head went quiet for a good 2 seconds like it's contemplating the idea. Captain, your energy seemed to have grown higher. That's a good sign. You haven't been in a good mood since you awoke from slumber. As your loyal first mate and second mate. Shut up, okay. After the goat head had quieted down, Duncan focused his attention back on the sea surface. The coffin seemed to have really sunk into the deep sea. But with the experience of the previous 2 times, Duncan was extra patient this time. Silently calculating the time and silently observing in wait. Then it happened. The doll reappeared in his line of sight as he expected. Amid a wave, the delicate wooden box that looked like a coffin had become a makeshift boat with the Gothic doll paddling the sides with her arms. Truly an imposing sight in how she managed such a feat against such waves. Naturally, Duncan was stunned for words at this sight.